So Harmony Gold once again gets its questionable rights for the Macross franchise as a whole, or so it wants us to think. And it will sit in its Robotech franchise as usual like some psychopath refusing to take the corpse out of that broken freezer in which it is kept, and rely on the dead merchandise, more failed products, and a pending Robotech live-action movie which will never see the light of day. At least, that seems to be the plan, and it may well still be the plan in the US of A, but not in the United Kingdom and Europe, where due to a court ruling on the so-called good faith agreement, Harmony Gold was ordered that it could only hold the rights insofar as their Robotech brand was concerned, and not to the Macross franchise as a whole. So Big West was finally given the opportunity to release Macross Plus on the big screen again, at least in the United Kingdom. And this is a big deal to many fans. For too long they had to sit on the goodwill of the Japanese companies themselves to subtitle their own Macross DVD releases in Japan to circumvent the untested legal issues in the United States. Shoji Karamori promising this since the release of Macross Delta, that all releases from Delta onwards would have the option to view Macross with English subtitles, thus making it easier, if not slightly more expensive as those import costs ain't cheap folks, that it should be, to watch more Macross legally. That said, the UK ruling opens up crossroads into introducing a whole new generation of Macross to young and old fans in Europe, and maybe to the US if you have friends willing to send you a DVD Blu-ray to watch in your multi-region DVD players. And it probably won't be long until a company like, say, Manga Entertainment UK once again at least laps up the opportunity to release Macross in the West and potentially challenge the status quo in the United States as well. It's pretty unlikely that Harmony Gold would not face a similar defeat in the United States court if the challenging party is willing to put up the costs in order to do so. And don't think I didn't give Harmony Gold a chance to come up with a middle ground here. The opportunity was there and they missed it. And it's highly unlikely they can profit from the new opportunity they unwittingly unleashed with their own greed. Of course, United Kingdom Macross fans have always been very lucky in the last 30 years with regards to Macross. In the early 1990s, the now defunct Koseki Films released the Macross 2 series, Macross Clash of the Bionoids, a rather atrocious dub of the movie, which in its own right is collectible just for the clash between the tremendous animation and the terrible dubbing, and the subtitled version of Do You Remember Love. 2 years later, Manga Video would then grace us with the unexpected release of Macross Plus, both in its OVA and movie formats, heralding the last of the great era that was anime before it devolved into the sad mass marketing mess it is today. US fans weren't so lucky with that fix though, and even though they got Macross 2 and Plus in the early 1990s, they have still yet to see a Blu-ray release of either, and Macross Plus in particular is in such high demand for such a release. It's part of the reason Harmony Gold gets so much of the hate it does as of late. Failed Kickstarters aside, that is. But we are not here to dwell on the negatives behind the Macross drama. No, we're here to focus on the gem that made Macross the cornerstone it is today. With the simple question, do you remember love? Do you remember love is an interesting question on the importance of culture and what it means to be human and the danger we face in losing it. It's also a re-examination of what Japan lost and gained as a result of imperialism and the heavy losses during, near the end and since the end of the Second World War. Moved on by the ever-expanding powers about them in Europe and America, Asia went through a militaristic phase between 1856 and 1945. Indeed, there are plenty of historians who would argue that it still does to this day, but that would require a history lesson all on its own. For now, let's focus on the rise and fall of the Japanese military expansion and how it relates to the story of Macross. Japan's culture has always been one of duty and service, and whilst it served to build a mighty nation, it soon turned to an imperialistic and xenophobic stance. It looked to its crown as a god, its military as angels of heaven, and its citizenry as important cogs in the mighty machine that was contributing to the expanding Japanese empire. There was a call to conform to the new world empire being built, for the people, the citizens, the military and royal alike, to serve the machine that was fast becoming a mindless grinder that was the expansion and superiority of the rising sun. And whilst the people could see no other way but to conform, there was a slight, underhanded resistance to the new regime, which, whilst largely private, was pocketed with some public displays of passionate demonstration. It's easy for us in the West who read the history books to overlook such pockets of resistance and guardians of culture when we're told nightmare stories of how islands occupied by the Allies were met with either military resistance that refused to back down in the face of defeat, or villages that committed mass suicide rather than submit to the occupying forces. The Daily Life in Wartime Japan, 1940 to 1945, written by Samuel Yamashita, draws from many examples of both private and public protest and resistance to the military culture of the Second World War from the private diaries and letters written by the population of Japan during that period. In particular, one incident in which a detachment of soldiers sent to remove 84,000 dead bodies from the firebombing of Tokyo, who were confronted by a woman who shouted at them, accusing them that all of this happened because of those military men. Japan had become the very architect of its own destruction because it refused to recognize the value of its own people and its relationship with the rest of the world. And its people, whilst the people of duty and service, soon came to recognize this folly and the massive cost it not only had on its population, but on its very self-identity. No longer were the people, or even the emperor, content with their lot to blindly serve the rising sun into its own dusk, but they recognized in the embers of their defeat that in order to preserve who they were as a people, they had to adapt as a people, now under occupation, in order to become a power to be reckoned with again. The emperor would become a man, much like the Zentradi would become Microns. The industry embraced Western practices, much like the Zentradi embraced a culture once alien to them. And in so doing, they maintained their own sense of identity and strength that in 40 years no other defeated nation has ever achieved. Japan, whilst very much westernized in many ways, somehow managed to merge its culture of servitude and duty with world industry, Western influence, and ironic pacifism. Japan survived by moving forward as opposed to how the West is now looking backward. Yes, it still maintains a sense of superiority and some xenophobia. It is a nation entrenched in tradition and history after all, and whilst not an excuse to such sentiments, it does go some way to explain how guarded Japan remains, not only in its relationship with the rest of the world, but against its own folly as it comes to grip with recent reminders of yet another near-nuclear holocaust on its doorstep with Fukushima. None of this, however, was easy. When the Americans came, they came with a culture that clashed with the traditional norms of the local population and was at odds with the militaristic enterprise that forged a once powerful empire now brought to its knees. Various pockets of military resistance who refused to surrender still remained throughout the 1940s up until the late 1990s, and while small in number, still tell an interesting story in the mindsets of Japanese military that was forged during World War II, as it was with Kyojin in the Macross series, who refused to surrender to the way of the Macronian and their culture in the tragic resistance that would lead to his ultimate demise. For me, it's easy to see how the Macross series, and in a much more condensed way, the Do You Remember Love movie, is about the conflict between the inhuman militaristic machine and the importance of culture and self-identity. It's a lazy observer who says how ridiculous a concept winning a war with a song is, but that's only if you don't really look into what the hidden message and the obvious overtones behind the series is. It wasn't the song that won the war, it was the need for self-identity. The Zentradi in the series were built for one purpose: war. They didn't understand the concept of friendship, entertainment, or even love. They had been so ingrained into a level of thinking that there was more to life than blindly following orders was a concept lost to them. And yet, for all their alien approach, they were still all too human, showing us emotional capacities such as pride, ego, and even self-sacrifice. The very danger of the Micron culture to their way of life was so absolute that their creators and commanders demanded either avoidance or complete sterilization of such a race if contact was unavoidable, including any of their agents that had been contaminated by the Microns. Star Trek fans in particular should be very familiar with that concept. A race as tyrannical and militaristic as the Terran Empire of the Mirror Universe could not afford the idealistic notions of the Federation risking its foundation, to the point that the Emperor was willing to kill her entire cabinet to keep the Federation a secret and preserve the Terran Empire.
What a quaint concept. Parallel universes. This is from the United Federation of Planets. And apparently, so are you.
What makes the movie diverge from the series is not that the Microns were a threat, but more a potential weapon. Whereas in the series, the Microns, that's us by the way in case you were keeping score, were caught up in an ancient conflict quite by accident. An alien spaceship lands in our world and we utilised it for our own defence. In the movie, however, the Macross is caught between an endless conflict between male and female giants who see the Macross both as a potential threat and a resource to be used against the other. The males initially thinking the Macross and the city within it is a female weapon, only later learning that it is a culture all on its own where men and women actually live and work together. Understandably, such a concept confuses them. How is this even possible? And if it is a weapon being used by the females to confuse and demoralize their troops, how can they turn it against the females to their own advantage? They're definitely going to have some issues with that tactic. That said, just because they're avoiding direct conflicts with the Macross doesn't mean that humanity has been left unscathed. Upon returning to Earth, two of the crew discovered that not only has the Earth been wiped out by the ensuing conflict between two races, but the Earth was the progenitor planet of the Zentradi and the Meltrandi, with humanity being the cultural offshoot of the protoculture they were built to defend in the first place. In short, all three races were not only supposed to be symbiotically related, but genetically they were exactly the same. Only their base instincts were refined into the service of the machine that eventually destroyed protoculture to begin with, and humanity was the deviation to the norm. Where the Zentradi and the Meltran could find no resolution because they had no common culture or ground to rest upon, the men and women of Earth found not only a way to coexist, but procreate without the need for cloning, largely because of their physical and to some extent emotional differences, and from that union they discovered love, and yes, culture.
だけど、巨人たちの戦争が激しくなりすぎて、ようやく間違いに気づいた人たちが、もう一度、男と女が一緒に暮らせる場所を求めて、この地球に逃げ延びてきたらしいの。
The ancient love song discovered by Misa doesn't win the war, but instead reawakens something lost in the two warring factions that in that moment they know they can't afford to lose again. Without something to fight for, their war is meaningless. And through the song that Minmay eventually sings at the end, a plain, simple love song, they finally find meaning to their formerly empty millennia of a violent existence. They don't simply drop everything and become pacifists, but instead find common ground to which they can utilize their warrior-honed instincts for something more beneficial, and as a result maintain their own identity as warriors whilst embracing the importance of self-determination and emotional interaction. Of course, condensing 13 episodes into a 2-hour movie is never an easy undertaking, but here they do it with liberties well taken. Yes, you're literally thrown into the middle of the conflict with no clear background as to why the Macross is out here in deep space. Some insight is helpful, but not necessarily for the focus of the movie. What it doesn't tell you is easily made up for with presumption on the fans' part or your part as a newcomer that the Macross isn't supposed to be out here this deep in space, and a city in a giant spaceship that turns into a robot is so preposterous it's easily overturned by the epic scale of the animated glory they put into the production. And by now, even that should be a familiar concept to most sci-fi fans by now. The inherent mystery as to why the two factions are fighting is not completely explained, but it doesn't have to be. The Zentradi and the Meltrani have been fighting for so long, they have no idea why they're fighting either. This forgotten drive is so much more a powerful storying exercise than actually laying it out for us by holding our hands. The point is not in the origin, but in how the dispute is settled. I do, however, take some issue with character interpretation here. Misa remains the militaristic career woman with a deep-rooted need for a normal companionship. Lin Minmay is still the spoiled diva who learns the value of her own humanity in the end. But Hikaru's misogyny in the beginning takes some getting used to. He does develop as the story develops, but his relationship with women in the beginning is pretty schizophrenic. On the one hand, he refuses to listen to his superior officer on the grounds that she's a woman. But on the other hand, he absolutely has no idea how to deal with one in person, and is almost offended when the worst repetition of Roy Fokker, a drunk lout who only happens to be an ace pilot, literally forces himself on a clearly weaker Claudia than a confident serious counterpart. When completely alone with Minmay, Hikaru is both a bumbling fanboy and clearly nervous in her presence. And what is it for his complete lack of respect for the chain of command, taking the most famous face on Macross out on a joy flight in the middle of an intergalactic war is certainly not the smartest thing to be doing to impress a girl. But it's Roy Fokker's character that disappoints me the most, with his 180-degree turn into an almost disrespectful drunk. Sure, he was a womanizer in the original series, but at least he had class. At least he was never disrespectful. He didn't ignore the chain of command, and neither did he force himself on a woman even if he was dating them. The fact that he tried to force kiss Minmay in this movie is a total portrayal of who he was as a man in the series as a true hero. And yes, whilst his death and self-sacrifice is moving, it is sadly marred by the character he portrayed early in the movie. It's supposed to be an emotional ending that's to what to all intents and purposes was nothing more than an asshole serving in the military. And if I'm going to take any negatives from this movie, it's certainly the Roy Fokker depiction, who lived and died so well in the series, so as they've given so much disservice in this movie adaptation. That said, I am satisfied with how the relationship between the three main characters, Misa, Hikaru and Minmay develop. It's organic and not forced. It's clear Hikaru's interest in Minmay is infatuation, and that Minmay's need for Hikaru is not so much love as it is a need for a hero to help her escape the trappings of her famous life. And Misa's stoic militaristic attitude, her breakdown in the second act, and the development as a woman with a true need for Hikaru in her life is satisfying. Minmay's turn to do what's right at the end is not a sudden one either. It's a revelation when she realizes that so much has been sacrificed to bring her to this moment, and that she's not a damsel in distress anymore, but an integral part of the effort itself. If all she can do is sing, and singing can help save the day, then that's exactly what she'll do. And yes, that moment of silence between Misa and Minmay at the end is a very telling story in its own right. Both truly in love with the same man, and yet Minmay is stronger for resigning to be alone. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. There is also a recognition that they both worked with the man they loved to bring peace and win the war. Where Minmay sang the song, Misa discovered the song and truly understood what Hikaru needed to become the man he is now. And yeah, I did cry as I watched Minmay tapping her foot in time to the content loneliness to which she is resigned and the warm darkness at the final curtain. Her place in history, for better or worse, is enshrined in galactic history. It's a bittersweet end to what should otherwise have been a happy ending. The animation, especially in full high definition 35 years later, is still the most beautiful animated movie in my opinion to date. Akira was a technical masterpiece and achievement, no doubt, but Do You Remember Love is the bar by which anime has been held to since. No CGI was used here. Every cell is intrinsically detailed from the technology to the characters. The dogfights in particular are a thing to wonder, and the mass death missile spam is made more famous as a result of its majestic, destructive beauty. In particular, the dogfight between Maria and Maximilian Genius in the second act. I challenge you to even find a CGI dogfight more iconic than this 35 years on. And the character designs are so much more beautiful to look at. Updated to hold more of an impact, they are a far cry from simple rehashes to serve a retelling, to an actual reboot long before rebooting was actually a major thing. Britai and Exodore are especially imposing with their new designs, with Exodore's design continuing on into Macross 7, which only makes me hope more and more for a Britai return in the later series. And is it me, or does the Macross actually look more imposing than it was in the original series? Considering this was made 2 years after the series, Do You Remember Love is clearly more than a retelling of the original series. It's clear from the end product that the creators did indeed remember the love they had for the original series as a whole. Do You Remember Love is a celebration of an age when anime wasn't merely good, but actually fantastical. Sure, there are great anime movies and shows today, even Macross Frontier is great in its own way, but Do You Remember Love is an achievement in the franchise's history that is yet to be topped, even amongst its own legacy. Visually, it's the most beautiful animated thing I've ever seen on screen. Story-wise, it's a lot deeper than many younger fans give it credit for. Character-wise, despite the one flaw with Roy Fokker, the protagonists are believable, flawed, and have a convincing arc that culminates in a satisfying conclusion. And I can't sign off without even touching on the music, even slightly. After all, that's what this movie is about. The song that won an intergalactic war. It's a fully orchestrated version of the series soundtrack that has more impact in its dramataz as a result. Yes, it's very Japanese 80s pop and orchestra, but for a product of its time, it fits perfectly into the opera narrative. And the actual song title, Do You Remember Love, remains a fitting anthem for all that was great about anime and how anime can be great going forward. I really miss those days. An anime about a boy and his robot was about the human drama behind it, compared to today where it's about impressing the girl or simply becoming the best of the best. I loved the flawed characters we had in the past as opposed to the kid that keeps on winning in the end, which is why I'm okay with Ash Ketchum in Pokemon never having won a tournament. I was much more interested in his journey than I was in the outcome. And to me, that's what Macross represents, the journey of mankind to a better outcome. Not to push for an agenda or a culture on another culture, but to show what it means to embrace cultures different from our own and still maintain an identity for ourselves within our own. Whilst I may have some issues with the sequels, I still enjoy their spirit, that humanity can move forward to a better, brighter future, not only among the stars, but among our own differences. When we finally accept who others are and that we can live with them rather than against them, that's when we as a people truly shine. It's our diversity of culture that makes us a unified culture to be reckoned with. And in today's age of divide and conquer, I think that's a message more important now than it has ever been before.